Rick Sanchez has been drunk since the first second you met him. Not tipsy, not having a good time. Drunk the way a person is drunk when sobriety is not an option anymore. When the alternative to the flask is feeling something so large it has no name. He has been carrying that feeling since before the show began. Since a bomb fell in a garage and took everything he had chosen over the entire universe. Everything after that, every adventure, every alien drug, every planet-sized bender, every elaborate scheme to avoid a single hour in a therapist's office, is Rick trying to solve a problem that cannot be solved, trying to fill a space that nothing in any dimension has ever been big enough to fill. Today, we are going to go through it, all of it, season by season, scene by scene, the flask, the crystals, the garage again, and what it all actually means. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let's begin. The flask that never empties. Alcohol as Rick's baseline state. Before we talk about the drugs, before we talk about the alien crystals and the planet-sized benders, and the garage where Rick almost didn't wake up, we need to talk about the flask, because the flask is always there. Before the adventure starts, during the adventure, after the adventure ends badly, when Rick is flying his ship through a meteor field at 3 a.m, when he is arguing with Jerry over breakfast, when he is supposedly saving the universe. The flask is in his coat pocket, and it is always full, and Rick is always drinking from it. Not sometimes, not when things get hard, always. Most people who watched the pilot episode of Rick and Morty for the first time probably laughed at it. Rick stumbling around, slurring his words, getting Morty out of bed in the middle of the night to fly somewhere dangerous. It played like a joke, a goofy, reckless old man who happened to be a genius. Haha. Moving on. But something interesting happens if you watch that first scene again, knowing what the show eventually tells you. Within the first 60 seconds, not the first episode, not the first act, the first 60 seconds, Rick is already drunk behind the wheel of his spaceship. He is flying through the night sky with his grandson in the passenger seat, slurring, barely in control, completely comfortable. This is not Rick having a bad night. This is Rick on a completely ordinary Tuesday. The show is not introducing a character who drinks too much. It is introducing a character for whom alcohol is simply the permanent condition of being alive. There is a word for that. It is not funny, though the show plays it funny for a while. It is addiction. Specifically, it is the kind of addiction that has gone on so long the person stopped noticing it. The kind where the drinking is not even about getting drunk anymore. It is about maintenance. It is about keeping the internal noise at a manageable level so you can function. Rick is not drunk the way someone is drunk at a party. Rick is drunk the way a car needs oil, because without it, the engine seizes. Watch any random episode from the first 2 seasons and track the flask. It is in almost every scene Rick appears in. He takes pulls from it between sentences. He refills it from bottles he keeps in his coat, in his lab, in the ship. He drinks before dangerous missions. He drinks after dangerous missions. He drinks during missions while simultaneously rewiring alien technology that would take a team of normal scientists a decade to understand. His hands are steady. His brain is sharp. His mouth is barely slurring. This is not a man getting drunk. This is a man who has been drinking so consistently for so long that his body has recalibrated what normal feels like. Normal, for Rick Sanchez, requires alcohol in the blood. Sobriety would feel like withdrawal. And the show knows this. The show is extremely aware of what it is doing. Even in season 1, even when it is playing the whole thing for laughs. Because Rick and Morty is not a show that puts things in accidentally. The creative team behind it, Dan Harmon especially, a person who has been publicly open about his own struggles with addiction, built Rick's alcoholism into the character's foundation on purpose. It is not a quirk, it is not flavor. It is the first and most important thing to understand about Rick Sanchez. Because everything else, every other choice he makes, every line he crosses, every relationship he damages, flows directly out of it. Here's the thing about functional addiction that most people get wrong. Functional means the person can still do things. It does not mean the person is okay. Rick can still invent technology that rewrites the rules of physics. Rick can still outthink every enemy he faces. Rick can still navigate the multiverse and survive scenarios that would kill 100 ordinary people. He is functional in the most extraordinary sense of that word. But functional is not the same as fine. Functional just means the addiction has found a way to coexist with the parts of life that absolutely have to keep running. The parts that can be let go, the emotional honesty, the stable relationships, the willingness to sit still long enough to feel something, those get eaten first. Look at how Rick moves through the house. He drifts through it. He does not have a room in the proper sense. He lives in the garage, which he has converted into a lab. The family is in there, in the house, with their dinners and their school mornings and their arguments about Jerry's job, and Rick is just slightly outside all of it. He participates when he wants to. He disappears when he does not. He keeps his flask on him at all times because the flask is the only constant in the picture. The family changes. The adventures change. The dimension they are living in alien, as the show eventually reveals, has already changed at least once. But the flask does not change. The flask is always there, always in his hand, always being lifted. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is the cleanest possible image of what addiction does to a person's life over a long enough timeline. Rick Sanchez is one of the smartest beings in the entire universe. He has access to every dimension, every planet, every possible version of reality. He could live anywhere. He could be anything. He has chosen to live in a garage next to a family he keeps at arm's length. And the most consistent relationship in his daily life is with a metal container full of alcohol. Not Morty, not Beth, the flask. Now here is something the show drops in, almost casually, in the season 1 finale. Rick has a best friend, a tall bird alien named Bird Person, who has known Rick longer than almost anyone. At the party in the finale, Bird Person pulls Morty aside to explain something. Morty has heard Rick say his famous catchphrase all season long, the loud, nonsensical phrase that Rick shouts at the end of almost every sentence in early episodes. Everyone treats it like a quirky Rick thing. Funny noise, move on. Bird Person tells Morty what it actually means. In Bird Person's language, that phrase translates to, "I am in great pain, please help me." Let that sit. Rick has been walking around all season, shouting his pain at everyone within earshot, in a language only one person in his circle can understand. And Bird Person follows this revelation with the confirmation that Rick uses drugs and alcohol to numb himself. Not to have fun, not because he is reckless, to numb himself. Because there is something inside Rick Sanchez that, without chemical assistance, is apparently unbearable to feel. The show does not tell you what that thing is in season 1. It gives you the information in pieces across multiple seasons, slowly building the picture of what happened to Rick before the story started. But even without those later reveals, the Bird Person conversation in the season 1 finale changes the entire texture of everything you have already watched. Go back to the pilot. Go back to Rick stumbling around, cracking jokes, dragging Morty into danger. Watch it again knowing that every time he reaches for that flask, he is managing pain so large he cannot function without chemical help. Watch it again knowing that the catchphrase you heard as a joke is actually a man telling everyone around him, in code, that he is not okay. The comedy does not disappear. Rick and Morty is still funny, but the laughter sits on top of something much heavier now, and the show put it there deliberately. This is also the moment where the essay's central argument becomes visible for the first time. Because the question worth asking is not just what Rick is numbing, the question is what he has done, what lines he has crossed, what people he has used, all in service of maintaining that numb. The flask is the beginning. What comes after the flask is where the story actually lives. And what comes after the flask is not pretty. Season 1 establishes the baseline. Rick drinks constantly, at a level that would floor a normal person, and it barely registers in his day-to-day behavior because his tolerance has had decades to build. He is not drinking to get somewhere. He is drinking to stay level. The alcohol is not the destination. It is the floor he stands on, the precondition for everything else. Remove it and the floor goes with it. This also explains something about Rick that is easy to miss in the early episodes. He is extremely hard to surprise. He has seen almost everything, been almost everywhere, done almost every kind of damage. He reacts to galaxy-ending catastrophes with the energy of someone annoyed by mild traffic. Part of that is his intelligence. He has calculated the odds and usually knows he will make it out. But part of it is the alcohol. The alcohol is blunting the edges of everything. The fear that should spike when his grandson is in danger. The grief that should hit when he sees yet another version of a life he could have had. The loneliness that should register every time he drifts back into that garage alone at the end of an adventure. All of it arrives slightly muffled, slightly dimmed, slightly easier to push past. That is the trade Rick has made. He gets to keep moving. He gets to stay functional. He gets to be the smartest, most capable, most indestructible presence in any room he walks into. And in exchange, he gives up the ability to fully feel any of it. The wins, the losses, the people, the moments that should matter. He has been making that trade so long he probably does not remember making it. The flask is just part of him now. Part of the coat, part of the character, part of the image. But somewhere underneath all of it, there is something the alcohol was originally called in to quiet. And the show is going to spend 7 seasons slowly, carefully, letting you see what that something is. Before we can get there, though, we need to stop at season 1, episode 11. Because Rick does not just drink in that episode. Rick also sends his 14-year-old grandson into a dangerous alien landscape under false pretenses. Not to save the family, not to complete the mission, but to get his hands on a drug he wants to snort off a table at his own house party. Quote, 0, That is where the drinking ends, and the addiction starts going somewhere much darker. Section 2. Quote 1. The catchphrase is a cry for help. There is a moment in season 1 that most people laughed at and then forgot about. It is not a big moment. It does not come with dramatic music or a slow camera move. It is a side conversation at a loud party between a bird alien and a nervous 14-year-old, lasting maybe 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, the show quietly drops the most important piece of information it will give you about Rick Sanchez in the entire first season. Morty is at the party Rick threw in the family home, the party that got so out of hand that the whole house ended up teleported to an alien planet. Bird Person is there. Bird Person is one of Rick's oldest friends, a tall, serious, feathered creature who talks slowly and means everything he says. Morty tells Bird Person that he is sick of Rick, sick of the adventures, sick of the chaos, sick of feeling like a prop in someone else's story. He says Rick does not care about anyone. Bird Person does not argue with him. He does not defend Rick the way a loyal friend might. Instead, he does something much more specific and much more honest. He tells Morty what Rick's catchphrase actually means. All season long, Rick has been shouting those words constantly. After every joke, after every explosion, after every narrow escape, the phrase became the sonic signature of the show before the first season was even finished. It got put on t-shirts. People shouted it at conventions. It got treated as the audio equivalent of Rick's personality. Loud, chaotic, too much, inexplicably funny. And then Bird Person translates it. In Bird Person's language, that phrase means, I am in great pain. Please help me. Not, I am having fun. Not, look how wild this is. Not, nothing matters, so let us laugh. I am in great pain. Please help me. Bird Person then tells Morty something else. He says Rick uses drugs and alcohol to numb himself. He says this plainly, without drama, as a simple fact. The kind of thing you say about a person you have known for a very long time and have watched closely. He is not shocked by it. He is not angry about it. He is just telling the truth about someone he loves, in a way that suggests he has known this truth for a long time and accepted it because he did not know what else to do with it. Then the party keeps going. The show moves on. Most viewers moved on too. But this scene is doing something that the rest of season 1 depends on you not fully registering yet. Because if you register it, if you actually hear what Bird Person is saying, then every scene you have already watched in season 1 stops being what it looked like and becomes something else entirely. Go back to the pilot. Rick is drunk, stumbling, dragging Morty out of bed. He is shouting that phrase after almost every sentence. You heard it as a silly noise. Now you know it means I am in great pain, please help me. He was saying it in the pilot. He was saying it in every episode since. He has been saying it over and over, constantly, loudly, to everyone within earshot, and nobody in his life speaks the language. Nobody except Bird Person. And Bird Person, rather than helping, has simply learned to accept it. This is one of the most quietly devastating things the show does in its entire run. It hides a man's distress call inside a joke. It makes the audience laugh at it for 11 episodes. Then it translates it, and suddenly the laugh has a bad feeling underneath it, because you realize you were laughing at someone asking for help while the people around him clapped along. Now think about what this means for the substance use. Bird Person does not say Rick drinks because he enjoys it. He does not say Rick drinks because he is reckless or irresponsible, or because he thinks rules do not apply to him. He says Rick uses drugs and alcohol to numb himself. The word numb is doing everything in that sentence. You do not numb something that does not hurt. You do not reach for a painkiller when there is no pain. Bird Person is telling Morty, and telling the audience, that underneath every joke, every adventure, every loud and chaotic moment of Rick being Rick, there is something hurting badly enough that it requires constant chemical management. The show does not tell you yet what that thing is. That will come later, in season 5, in a long and painful episode that finally shows you who Rick was before everything went wrong. But the Bird Person conversation in season 1 is the arrow pointing at it. It is the show saying, there is a wound. We are not going to show it to you today, but it is there, and the flask is covering it, and the catchphrase is screaming about it, and nobody is listening. This matters for understanding Rick's addiction because of what it tells you about the function of the substance use. A lot of people use alcohol and drugs for a lot of different reasons. Some people drink socially. Some people drink out of habit. Some people drink because they are bored. Rick is not doing any of those things. Rick is drinking and using drugs because there is a level of pain inside him that he cannot manage without them. That is a specific kind of relationship with substances. That is not recreational. That is survival. And here is what makes it even more specific. Rick is the smartest being in the universe. He can build technology that bends the rules of physics. He has access to every planet, every dimension, every possible version of reality. If there were a better solution to his pain, Rick Sanchez would have found it. He is not using alcohol because he does not know any better. He is using it because, for whatever reason, it is the solution he chose. Or more accurately, it is the solution he found when he needed one badly enough, and it worked just well enough to keep using, and now it is not a choice anymore. It is just how he functions. That distinction matters. There is a difference between someone who has not looked for a better way and someone who has looked and still landed here. Rick lands here on purpose because the alternative actually feeling what is underneath is something he has decided he cannot do. Bird Person confirms this without being able to do anything about it. He knows. He has always known, and he watches Rick keep drinking. Think about how lonely that is. Not for Bird Person, for Rick. Rick has exactly one friend in the entire universe who knows what is really going on with him. One person who speaks the language and can hear the real message behind the catchphrase. And even that person has not helped. Not because Bird Person does not care. You can tell from the way he talks about Rick to Morty that he cares deeply, but there is nothing to do with the information. Rick does not want to be reached. The catchphrase is a cry for help in a language he chose specifically because nobody around him speaks it. It is loud enough to feel like honesty. It is coded enough to function as protection. Rick is saying I am in great pain and simultaneously making sure nobody can respond to it. That is not a person who wants help. That is a person who wants to have asked for it. Those are two completely different things, and Rick and Morty understands the difference better than most shows about addiction ever have. Because what the show is building, slowly, across multiple seasons, is a portrait of a man who is self-aware enough to know exactly what is wrong with him and still completely unable to stop. Rick is not confused about his situation. He is not deluded about what the flask is doing. He is not accidentally self-destructing. He is doing it deliberately, with full knowledge, because the alternative requires a kind of bravery he cannot access. The catchphrase proves this. He came up with a phrase that encodes his pain perfectly, in a real language that real people speak, just not any of the people he spends his time with. That required thought. That required a level of self-awareness that most people never reach. Rick knows he is in great pain. Rick knows he needs help. Rick is actively choosing to communicate that knowledge in a way that ensures it will not be acted on. And then he pours another drink. This is also where the show starts building something that will become increasingly important as the seasons go on. The gap between what Rick projects and what Rick is. The projection is loud and confident and does not care about anything. The reality, according to his oldest friend, is a man in enormous pain who reaches for chemical numbing as a daily survival strategy. Every season adds more evidence to that gap. Every moment where Rick acts like nothing matters is the projection. Every flask, every drug, every morning passed out in the garage is the reality bleeding through. Bird Person gives Morty, and the audience, the key to reading Rick correctly in 30 seconds flat. The rest of the show is the proof that he was right. There is one more thing worth noting about this scene before we move on. Morty hears what Bird Person says. He takes it in, and then he keeps going on adventures with Rick. He keeps being used as a human shield and a tool and a companion in ways that cost him more than they should. He keeps caring about Rick, even when Rick makes it expensive to do so. And the reason he does that is at least partly because Bird Person gave him a frame for it. Rick is in pain. Rick is numbing it. Rick is not a monster. He is a person who found a terrible solution to a real problem and got stuck there. That framing is generous, maybe too generous, but it is the one the show offers, and it is important to hold on to it as the story gets darker, because it gets much darker. The drinking that looks casual in season 1 is going to look completely different by the time you have seen what it was covering. And the catchphrase that started as a running gag is going to stop being funny the moment you understand what it was always saying. Rick has been asking for help since the first episode. He built the request into the architecture of his own personality, hid it in plain sight, made it into a joke so nobody would have to take it seriously. That is not the behavior of someone who is fine. That is the behavior of someone who has been not fine for so long they forgot what fine felt like, and they have stopped believing anyone would help them even if they asked in a language everyone understood. The flask handles the rest. But here is the part of the story that nobody in Rick's life knows yet. Not Morty, not Beth, not even Bird Person. The drinking did not start as a daily habit. It started as a response to something specific. Something that happened to Rick before the show began. Before he showed up in that garage. Before he became the character you see stumbling around in the pilot. Something so bad that it sent him to the bottle in the first place. And kept him there for years. Moving through the universe with a flask in his hand and a phrase on his lips that only one person on the planet could translate. __quote _2 __. But before we get to that though, we need to watch what happens when the drinking is not enough on its own. Because in season 1, Rick finds something stronger, and he lies to his grandson to get it. Section 3. Calaxian Crystals. When Rick lies to his grandson to get high. There is a version of the Calaxian Crystals scene that is easy to watch and easy to laugh at. Rick snorts alien drugs off a table at his own house party. He makes a face. His eyes go bright blue. He announces that the high is strong, but short. Everyone moves on. Haha, Rick being Rick. Next scene. That is the version most people remember. And that version is not wrong. It is funny, the way a lot of things Rick does are funny on the surface. But the surface is not where the story is. The story is in everything that happened before Rick got those crystals onto that table, because getting them there required Rick to do something that the show does not draw attention to, does not underline, does not comment on. It just shows it happening and lets you sit with it. Rick lied to his grandson. He sent Morty into a dangerous alien wilderness, and he did it to get high. That is the actual sequence of events, not a summary, not a reading between the lines. The literal thing that happens in Season 1, Episode 11, Ricksy Business, if you watch it carefully. Here's how it goes. Rick throws a party at the house while Beth and Jerry are away. The party gets so out of control that the entire house gets transported to an alien planet. The planet is strange and potentially dangerous. At this point, the reasonable thing, the thing Rick tells everyone, including Morty, is that they need the Calaxian crystals because those crystals are what will get the house back home. That is the story. That is what Morty believes. That is why Morty agrees to go get them, trudging off into an alien landscape with a genetically confused, half-Lincoln, half-Hitler clone and a girl named Nancy. The alien landscape is not safe. There are creatures out there. Morty is 14 years old. He has no special powers, no armor, no real training. He is out there in the dark of an alien planet because his grandfather told him that the crystals were necessary, that they needed them to get home, that this was important. They were not necessary to get home. Rick could have gotten home whenever he wanted. He just wanted to stay at the party. And more specifically, he wanted the crystals not because they were fuel, not because they were a key component of some plan, but because they are a drug, a very strong one. The kind Rick described as a powerful but short-lived high. When Morty comes back with the crystals, this becomes undeniably clear. Rick takes them immediately. He is not interested in the getting home part of the mission anymore. He crushes the crystals up and snorts them right there at the party. His eyes go blue. He announces the high is good. That is the whole mission. That was always the whole mission. Morty is furious when he realizes this. He throws the remaining crystals away. Rick, still coming down, immediately starts asking everyone at the party if they have any more. Bird person, Squanchy, anyone. He needs more. The high is already fading and he needs more right now. That last part is worth paying attention to. Rick is not satisfied with what he got. He immediately starts chasing another hit. This is not a person trying something out of curiosity. This is a person with a deep, established relationship with getting high, who is now annoyed that the supply ran out too fast. The party, the house being transported, Morty risking his safety, all of it was, in the end, a framework for Rick to get access to something he wanted to use. Everything else was secondary. Now step back and think about what this means in the context of everything Section 1 and Section 2 established. Section 1 told you that Rick drinks constantly, at a level that requires no thought because alcohol is simply the floor he stands on. It is maintenance. It keeps the internal noise manageable. Section 2 told you that the internal noise exists because Rick is in great pain, real, deep, serious pain, and that he uses substances specifically to numb that pain, and that this is not a recent development, but something his oldest friend has watched and accepted for as long as they have known each other. So here in Section 3, we learn something new. We learn that the alcohol, the constant, daily, flask-sized amount of alcohol, is apparently not always enough. Sometimes Rick wants something stronger, something that hits faster and harder. The kind of drug that turns your eyes blue and gives you a powerful rush that only lasts a short time, which means you need to keep going back for more. And when Rick wants that thing, when the need for it is there, he will construct a situation that gets him access to it. He will tell a story. He will invent a reason. He will send the people around him into danger under false pretenses, and he will do it without appearing to feel bad about it, because the need has become bigger than the honesty. This is a significant line to cross. There is a meaningful difference between someone who uses substances to cope and someone who lies to the people they love to get access to those substances. Both are serious. But the second one means the addiction has started making decisions. It has started overriding things, like Rick's relationship with Morty, like Morty's safety, like the basic trust that holds their whole dynamic together. The addiction is now the one calling the shots, and Rick is just executing the plan it came up with. The show does not make a big deal of this. That is important. Rick and Morty does not stop to have a conversation about what just happened. Morty gets angry, throws the crystals, and the episode moves on. The show trusts you to register it without being walked through it, but the information is there, sitting in the episode, and it does not go away. Rick's system does not register regular Earth drugs anymore. This is something that gets confirmed later. The idea that Rick has used so many substances at such high levels for such a long time that normal things no longer do anything for him. He needs alien drugs because his body has essentially outgrown everything available on this planet. That is not a casual observation. addiction. That is what decades of heavy, consistent substance use does to a person's body. The threshold keeps rising. What worked before stops working. You need more. You need stronger. You need things that come from further away and hit harder and last shorter, which means the chasing never stops. The Calaxian crystals are the first time the show makes this visible. Rick is not reaching for the flask here. The flask is fine for daily operation, but this is a party. This is a moment, and Rick wants to feel something that the flask alone cannot deliver, so he finds a way. And the way he finds requires Morty. This is worth sitting with because it becomes a pattern. Not always with crystals, not always in the same way, but the basic structure repeats throughout the show. Rick needs something. Rick constructs a reason for Morty to be involved. Morty gets involved, often at personal risk. Rick gets what he actually needed. The stated reason turns out to have been, at best, secondary. People who study addiction talk about this as a feature of serious, long-term substance dependence. The person does not usually sit down and think, I am going to deceive the people around me to get what I need. It is subtler than that. The need becomes the background assumption, and then the person builds everything else around it. The story, the logic, the reason they give. All of it gets constructed after the need has already decided what is going to happen. Rick probably does not experience the Calaxian crystal's plan as, I am going to trick Morty. He probably experiences it as a sequence of reasonable decisions that just happen to end with him getting what he wanted. That is what makes it so hard to recognize from the outside, and that is why Morty did not see it coming. He trusted that Rick had a real reason. He went, he came back with the crystals, and then he watched his grandfather crush them on a table and snort them while the real reason became impossible to ignore. There is another layer to this that the show does not state directly, but builds into the scene clearly enough. Bird Person is at this party. Bird Person, who in the same episode tells Morty that Rick uses drugs and alcohol to numb his pain, watches all of this happen. He watches Rick send Morty to get the crystals. He watches Rick use them. He presumably knows what Rick told Morty they were for and what they were actually for. And he does not say anything. He does not pull Rick aside. He does not warn Morty ahead of time. Bird Person loves Rick. That much is clear across every scene they share. But Bird Person has also learned, over a very long friendship, that there is no intervention he can offer that Rick will accept. He has found a way to be around Rick without trying to fix him, because trying to fix Rick does not work. So he watches. He stays. He translates the catchphrase to Morty when Morty needs to understand something, but he does not get in the way of the drinking, or the drug use, or the choices Rick makes to maintain both. That kind of acceptance, from a person who genuinely cares, is one of the saddest things in the show. It means the people who love Rick have concluded, probably correctly, that there is nothing they can do. The addiction has been present long enough and has been protected well enough that even friendship cannot reach it. What Bird Person can do is make sure Morty understands the frame. That is what the conversation in this episode is really for. He is not telling Morty something that will change Rick. He is telling Morty something that will help Morty survive being around Rick. A way of understanding the behavior that makes it less personal, less about Morty specifically, more about the shape of Rick's damage. Rick lied to you to get drugs. That is real and it is bad. But here is the context. Rick is in great pain, and he has been managing that pain this way for a very long time. And it is not really about you, even when you are the one who gets sent into danger. That is a lot to put on a 14-year-old. The show does not comment on that either. It just keeps moving. The Calaxian crystals moment also tells you something important about how Rick experiences his own behavior. When Morty confronts him, when the truth is obvious and unavoidable, and Morty throws the remaining crystals away in anger, Rick does not apologize. He does not get defensive. He does not try to explain himself or make Morty feel better about what just happened. He immediately turns to the other party guests and asks if anyone else has more. He has already passed the confrontation. He is already in the next moment, which is the moment where the high is fading, and he needs more before it goes completely. That is not callousness, though it looks like it. That is the priority structure of serious addiction laid out in real time. The need is at the top. Everything else, including Morty's anger, including the relationship, including the basic social expectation that you acknowledge when you have wronged someone, falls below it. Not because those things do not matter to Rick, but because in that moment, the need is louder than all of them combined. The blue eyes, the short-lived high, the immediate search for more. These are not details the show threw in to make Rick seem edgier. They are a specific and accurate picture of how this kind of use works. The substance hits hard. It fades fast. The space between the hit and the fade is where the person lives, chasing the next one before the current one is completely gone. And Rick is right there in that space, at his own house party, on an alien planet, with his grandson furious at him 6 feet away. He barely notices. He is looking for more crystals. This is still early in the show. Still season 1. Still the version of Rick that the audience is just getting to know. know, and already the pattern is fully visible to anyone paying attention. The drinking maintains the baseline. When the baseline is not enough, Rick reaches for something stronger, and when reaching for that something requires lying to the people he loves and putting them at risk, that is what happens. Not as a decision, as a reflex, as the automatic behavior of a person whose addiction has been in charge long enough that it does not need his conscious input anymore. Season 1 ends here. The crystals are gone, the high is fading, the house goes home. __quote _3 ___. But the appetite that sent Morty into that alien darkness does not go anywhere. It just waits for the next opportunity. And in Season 2, Rick finds an opportunity so large it takes an entire planet to contain it, and still manages to end in the loneliest garage scene the show has ever produced. Section 4, Unity's Planet, a whole world as one long bender. Season 2, Episode 3, Autoerotic Assimilation. This is the episode where Rick gets access to an entire planet and uses it the way he uses everything else, as a vehicle for his own appetite. And what happens on that planet over the course of about 20 minutes of television is the clearest and most complete picture the show ever gives you of what Rick's substance use looks like when there are no limits on it. No family, no schedule, no flask that runs out, just Rick with access to everybody on a populated world doing whatever he wants for as long as he wants. The result is not fun to watch. Not really. Not if you're paying attention. Here's how it starts. Rick is flying through space with Morty and Summer when they pick up a distress signal from an alien ship. Rick's instinct, stated plainly, is that most distress signals mean there are dead aliens and free things to take, so they board the ship. And what they find, instead of a disaster, is Unity, a creature Rick used to have a relationship with, a hive mind that can take over the bodies of every living thing on an entire planet and use them all at once like one enormous person made of thousands of individual pieces. Rick and Unity have history, complicated history, the kind of history where two people, or in this case, a person and a planet-sized organism, had something real together, and it ended badly, and there is still something there when they see each other again. Unity has taken over an entire planet. Rick sees the planet as an opportunity. They pick up where they left off. What follows is a bender. Not a bender the way a normal person understands the word. A bad weekend, a few too many nights in a row, a headache on Monday morning. A bender the way only Rick Sanchez can have one, which means using an entire planet's worth of bodies and resources to consume every substance and experience available at maximum intensity for what appears to be several days straight. The show does not linger on every detail of what Rick does during this time. It shows enough. Rick and Unity, using the bodies of the planet's population, party in ways that would be physically impossible for a single person. Rick makes requests, increasingly extreme ones, and Unity fulfills them because Unity can use any body on the planet to do so. The substances available are not Earth substances. This is an alien world with alien chemistry, which means Rick has access to things that do not exist in any form he has tried before. For a man whose system no longer responds to regular drugs, this is exactly the kind of situation he has been looking for. This is not vacation. This is not Rick relaxing after a hard stretch. This is Rick with the lid off. And this is where the episode does something quietly brilliant. In the middle of all this, Unity says something that functions as the clearest possible statement of what drug use is actually for. She says, recreational substances were phased out here. There is no need to escape from the self when your world is one. Stop there. Read that again. There is no need to escape from the self when your world is one. Unity is a hive mind. She has no single self to escape from. She is every person on the planet simultaneously, a consciousness spread across thousands of bodies with no individual point of pain, no singular wound, no one place where the loneliness collects. She does not use substances because she does not have a self that needs escaping. The substances disappeared from her world because the reason people reach for them in the first place, the unbearable weight of being a single, isolated, hurting person, simply does not apply to her. Rick, on the other hand, is the most isolated being in the universe. He is the only person at his level of intelligence. He exists in a reality where no one can fully understand him, no one can match him, and the things that hurt him are things nobody around him can even process. He has exactly one self, and that self is carrying something enormous, and the flask is never quite big enough, and the crystals only last a short time. And so when an entire planet worth of substances becomes available to him, he does not pace himself. He does not stop. He goes until Unity realizes what is happening and decides she has to leave, because that is what ends it. Not Rick deciding he has had enough. Not Rick recognizing that things have gone too far. Unity ends it. Unity, who has been right there with him through all of it, who has been matching his energy and enabling every request and giving him access to whatever he wanted. Unity is the one who looks at what they have been doing and decides it cannot continue. Not because she is weak, because she is smart enough to see what Rick cannot or will not see about himself. The goodbye note Unity leaves says it clearly. She tells Rick that when she is with him, she loses who she is and becomes part of him. Not because he forces it, because his gravity is that strong. Rick does not need to assimilate people the way Unity does. He does it through proximity. The people around him, and the organisms around him, and apparently the planet-spanning hive minds around him, get pulled into his orbit and start reflecting him back. His chaos becomes their chaos. His appetite becomes their appetite. His need to escape becomes the shared project. Unity recognizes this and leaves. She tells him, essentially, that she cannot be around him and remain herself, because what he does is consume everything until there is nothing left. The substances, the experiences, the people, all of it gets consumed. Summer and Morty see this happening in real time during the episode. They watch Rick drag Unity into a spiral that begins to affect the entire planet. The population, no longer fully under Unity's control because her attention is on Rick, starts fracturing. The civilization she built begins to collapse. Real damage is happening to real people, or whatever counts as people on this planet, because Rick's bender is so total and so consuming that even a hive mind cannot maintain basic planetary management while participating in it. Morty and Summer tell Rick and Unity, at a certain point, to take care of themselves. They walk away. They have seen enough. And what they are walking away from is not just a party that got out of hand. They are walking away from something that, if left unchecked, would not have a natural stopping point. Rick does not have a stopping point. He does not know when enough is enough, because enough is not the goal. The goal is not feeling whatever is underneath. As long as the substances keep coming and the experiences keep escalating, he does not have to feel it. So the escalation is not excess. It is the point. Unity sees all of this and still leaves. She has to. The goodbye note makes this plain. She tells Rick that in a strange way, he is better at what she does than she is, without even trying. She means that Rick absorbs people. He pulls them into his version of reality and reshapes them around his own needs. She assimilates planets by choice, consciously, deliberately. Rick does it just by being Rick. And when those two forces combined, they made something that neither of them could control. Rick, reading this, does not argue with it. He does not chase after Unity and tell her she is wrong. He does not construct a plan to win her back or convince her the bender was worth it. He goes home. This is important. Rick going home quietly, no fight, no scheme, no defiant speech, is the show telling you something about where Rick is at the end of this episode. He is not angry. He is not defensive. He is deflated. The bender is over. Unity is gone. The planet is behind him. And whatever the substances and the chaos and the escalating experience were covering up, it is now fully uncovered, with nothing between Rick and it. He walks into the house. Beth confronts him about something she found in the garage. Rick, who in almost every other situation would have a plan and a fast-talking response and an exit route, simply concedes. He agrees to whatever she wants. He is not present enough to fight. He has spent whatever he had on the planet, and now there is nothing left, and he walks into the garage. What happens in the garage is Section 5. This section is not going to describe it yet, but the garage is where the planet-sized bender ends up. That is where it was always going to end up. All that consumption, all those substances, all those days of using everything available to stay away from the feeling underneath, and the feeling was waiting for him in the garage at home the whole time. Unchanged, patient, right where he left it. This is the thing about using substances as a way of escaping from yourself. You can go very far. Rick went to another planet. He had access to resources and experiences that do not exist anywhere on Earth. He had a companion willing to match every escalation. He had days of uninterrupted access to whatever he wanted, and he still came home. You always come home. The self does not stop existing while you are away from it. It just waits. Unity understood this. She told him, in the note, that there is no need to escape from the self when your world is one. She was not just describing herself. She was describing what Rick has been running from. She was telling him, as gently as a goodbye letter can tell someone something this hard, that the running has a shape and a reason and a destination, and that destination is always the same. Rick did not argue with that either. He went to the garage. There is something worth noting about what the planet-sized bender represents in the larger arc of Rick's addiction. Section 3 showed Rick lying to Morty to get access to crystals he could snort at a party. That was Rick going slightly further than the flask allowed. Section 4 is a massive jump from that. An entire planet. Days. A companion capable of giving him literally anything he asked for. The escalation between those two moments, between the crystals at a house party and a planetary bender with a hive mind, is not random. It follows the logic of how serious addiction moves. What was enough last time is not enough this time. The ceiling keeps rising. The resources required to reach it keep expanding. Rick went from a flask to alien crystals to a whole planet, and a whole planet still still was not enough to fix the thing the flask was originally meant to fix. It never will be. That is the part Rick knows and cannot say out loud. That is what Unity saw and why she had to leave. The substances are not the problem. The problem is what the substances are for. And the problem is not going anywhere. The worst part of this episode is not the bender. It is not Unity leaving. It is not even the damaged civilization Rick leaves behind on that planet without a second thought. The worst part is what happens after. Because when the bender ends, and the companion leaves, and the substances are gone, and Rick is alone in the garage with the thing he was running from, he does not ask for help. He does not call Bird Person. He does not walk back into the house and sit down with his family. __quote _4___. He does something else entirely. And it is the most honest thing the show has ever shown about what happens to a person when every escape route closes at once. Section 5. The Garage. Passed out, alone, alive by accident. The song that plays at the end of Autoerotic Assimilation is called Do You Feel It by a band called Chaos Chaos. It is quiet, it is slow. It sounds like something you would hear at the end of a very long night when you were the only person still awake. And it plays over a scene that has no dialogue, no jokes, no action, and no resolution. Just Rick, alone in his garage at the end of everything. This is the scene that changed how a lot of people understood the show. Not because it is loud or dramatic or built around a big reveal, because it is not any of those things. It is one of the quietest scenes in the entire series. And it earns that quiet by putting it at the end of an episode that spent 20 minutes showing you exactly how a person arrives at this particular kind of alone. Here is what happens. Rick comes home from the planet. The bender is over. Unity is gone. Rick walks into the house and Beth confronts him about something she found in the garage. An alien she did not know about. A creature he had been keeping there. In almost any other situation, Rick would have a story ready. A fast explanation. Something clever that redirects the conversation and makes him look like the one in control. This time, he does not do any of that. He simply agrees to whatever Beth is asking. He concedes without a fight. Then he walks to the garage and closes the door behind him. What he does in that garage, he does alone. First, he goes to a freezer he has been keeping in the back. Inside is a creature. Small, strange, clearly in some kind of distress. Rick unfreezes it. He holds it gently. He comforts it while it screams. He is tender with it in a way he almost never lets himself be tender with anything, because in that moment, he is not performing for anyone. There is nobody watching, nobody to maintain the image for. He pets the creature. He soothes it. And then, with the same device he used to comfort it, he vaporizes it. He puts it out of its misery. Then he turns the device on himself. He sets up the machine. He positions it. He sits down in front of it and waits for it to be ready to fire. The song is playing. The camera is pulling back. And Rick Sanchez, the smartest being in the universe, the man who has survived every catastrophe the show has thrown at him, sits in his garage and waits to die. The machine does not fire. Not because Rick changes his mind. Not because someone walks in and stops him. Rick passes out before it is ready. The alcohol in his system, the constant baseline level of alcohol he has been maintaining for what the show implies is decades, finally takes him down before the machine can finish preparing. He slumps forward onto his workbench, unconscious, alive, not saved, alive by accident. The camera pulls all the way back and holds on that image. Rick passed out at his desk, the song still playing. And then, outside the garage window, Jerry appears, cheerfully mowing the weeds in the driveway, completely unaware, happy, the way Jerry is always almost happy when Rick is not around to make him feel small. The contrast is not subtle, and it is not meant to be. The show places the most devastating scene it has produced next to the most ordinary domestic image it can find, and lets them sit side by side without comment. Nobody knows. Nobody comes. The garage stays closed. This scene has been discussed a lot since the episode aired in 2015. Fans wrote about it, critics wrote about it. People called it one of the best things the show ever did. And the reason it hit so hard, the reason people who saw it once still remember exactly how it felt, is that it does not explain itself. It does not set up a lesson or a conversation or a consequence. Rick is not caught. He is not confronted. He does not have a moment of clarity. He just passes out, and the night ends, and the next morning he is still at his desk, and the world has continued without noticing that anything happened. That is a very accurate picture of how this kind of moment usually goes. Not with a dramatic intervention, not with a family gathering around and saying, "We are worried about you," with silence, with the person alone in a room doing something irreversible, and nobody on the other side of the door having any idea, because the person is very good at making sure nobody has any idea. Rick has spent years, possibly decades, perfecting the presentation of someone who does not need help. He shouts a phrase that means, "I am in great pain," in a language nobody speaks. He drinks drinks where people can see him, but never enough to seem out of control. He uses drugs when the drinking is not enough, but always with a cover story, always with a stated reason that is not the real one. All of that protection, all of that careful, practiced management of what the outside world sees, means that when things get bad enough to bring him to this garage, there is no one positioned to notice. He built the walls too well. Think about what the episode showed you in the hours before this scene. Rick had access to an entire planet. He had a companion willing to match every escalation. He had substances that do not exist anywhere on Earth. He had days of uninterrupted consumption. And after all of that, after using every resource available to stay away from the feeling underneath, the feeling was still there, waiting in the garage, exactly as large as it was when he left. That is the thing about substances as a way of managing pain. They do not reduce the pain, they delay it. They push it into the next room and close the door and buy you some time. But the door does not lock, and eventually you run out of things to push against it, and the room is on the other side of the door when you get home, and it is exactly as full as it was before you left. Sometimes fuller, because while you were gone, it collected everything you did not feel while you were not feeling it. Rick had a planet-sized delay, and then he came home, and there it was. The creature in the freezer is one of the details from this scene that people do not always talk about, but it matters. Rick had been keeping this creature, clearly suffering, clearly in some kind of ongoing distress, stored in his garage. He did not put it down. He did not cure it. He kept it frozen, in a kind of suspended state, not living fully and not dying. He comforted it before he ended it. He was gentle with it in a way that suggests he felt something real for it, or at least felt something in proximity to it that he could not access in proximity to people. There is a reading of that creature that is almost too on the nose to say out loud, but the show puts it there anyway. Rick kept a suffering thing alive in his garage, frozen, unable to get better, unable to stop hurting. He knew it was suffering. He kept it anyway. And then, in a moment of total honesty, the most honest moment the episode gives him, he decided that continuing to exist in that state was not something he wanted for it. He made the choice he felt was kind, and then he tried to make the same choice for himself. He saw something in that creature that he recognized. He is not the first person the show has drawn that comparison for, and he will not be the last. But this is the most direct the show gets about it in the first 2 seasons. Rick keeps suffering things alive, including himself. And in this garage, in this moment, he decided he was done with that. The fact that he survives is not triumphant. This is important to say clearly. Rick does not survive because he found a reason to live, or because something stopped him, or because the universe intervened in a meaningful way. He survives because he drank too much and his body shut down before the machine was ready. His addiction saved his life, not through healing, not through clarity, through simple physical incapacitation. The very thing that brought him to this point is the thing that stopped him from finishing what he started. That is not a happy ending. It is barely an ending at all. It is just what happened, presented without commentary. And then the camera pulls back to Jerry and the weeds and the ordinary morning that is arriving, whether Rick is awake to see it or not. The show never directly addresses this scene in subsequent episodes. It is not brought up by the family. Nobody says, "We noticed you were in bad shape that night." Nobody checks in. The garage stays the garage. Rick stays Rick. The flask is back in his hand by the next episode. This is completely realistic, and it is also one of the saddest things about the scene. Real moments like this one, moments where someone comes very close to not being here anymore, often happen without anyone knowing. And without anyone knowing, nothing changes. The person wakes up and pours another drink and goes on. That is what Rick does. He wakes up at his desk and he goes on. What makes this scene specifically connected to his addiction, and not just to his emotional pain, is the role the alcohol plays in it. The substances are present at both ends. They are what the whole planet was for, the entire bender that preceded this moment. And then, they are what stops him from completing the act. The thing he uses to escape from the pain is also the thing that keeps him alive when the pain becomes unbearable. His addiction is so deep, so consistent, so physically total, that it accidentally protects him from the worst consequence of his own despair. There is no way to frame that as a good thing. It is not a good thing, but it is the truth of what happens in this scene. And the show presents it without trying to clean it up or make it mean something hopeful. Rick drinks so much on Unity's planet that he passes out before he can die. That is where Season 2, Episode 3 leaves him. Fans called this scene one of the most real portrayals of what male pain looks like when it has nowhere left to go. Not dramatic, not announced. A person in a room, alone, quiet, done. The song playing, the machine not quite ready, the body failing before the decision can be completed. And then Jerry outside with the weeds, happy in his not knowing. The show does not ask you to feel good about any of this. It does not tie it to a lesson or a conversation or a change in Rick's behavior going forward. What it does is show you the destination. This is where the flask and the crystals and the planet-sized bender all lead, when they run out at the same time and there is nothing left to reach for. This This is the garage. This is what is underneath. The audience needed to see this, because everything that comes after, every joke, every adventure, every moment where Rick is brilliant and reckless and seemingly indestructible, now has this scene underneath it. You know the garage exists. You know what happened there. And you know that Rick woke up the next morning and did not tell anyone. He just kept going, which is the most human thing about him, and also the most heartbreaking. __quote _5 ___. But the show is not finished with Rick's avoidance yet, because in Season 3, Rick faces the one thing that should force him to confront what is going on. The one situation you cannot drink your way out of, cannot bender your way around, cannot snort and sniff and swallow your way past. A therapist, a single room, a chair, no exits, and Rick turns himself into a pickle. Section 6, Pickle Rick, Engineering an Escape from Sobriety of the Soul. Season 3, Episode 3, Pickle Rick. Everyone knows this episode. It is probably the most famous episode of the entire show. It got put on t-shirts and phone cases and into memes that spread so far and so fast that people who had never watched a single episode of Rick and Morty still somehow knew the phrase. The image of Rick as a pickle became one of the most recognizable images in animation. People treated it as the ultimate expression of Rick being Rick. Absurd, chaotic, brilliant, hilarious. Almost nobody talked about what the episode is actually about. Because Pickle Rick is not an episode about a man who turns himself into a vegetable for fun. It is an episode about a man so afraid of being known, so terrified of sitting in a room and having someone look directly at what is going on inside him, that he performs an irreversible physical transformation on his own body rather than go to therapy. The pickle is not the joke. The pickle is the symptom. The joke is that Rick would rather survive a sewer full of rats and fight his way through an entire building full of armed guards than spend an hour on a couch talking honestly about his feelings. And it works. As comedy, it completely works. The rat killing sequence is genuinely one of the most entertaining things the show has ever animated. But the comedy is covering something, the same way Rick's comedy always covers something. And by the end of the episode, the cover comes completely off. Here is what actually happens. The Smith family, Beth, Summer, and Morty, are scheduled to attend a family therapy session. This is not optional. The school has recommended it. The family has agreed to go. Rick has agreed to go. And then, the morning of the session, Morty walks into the garage and finds Rick on the workbench, having turned himself into a pickle. Not a small change. Not something reversible in 5 minutes. Rick has removed his own arms and legs and transformed his entire body into a cucumber family vegetable. He announces that he did it because he could. Because science. Because why not? Morty is not fooled for even a second. He looks up and spots a syringe hanging above the workbench on a small timer. A syringe that is clearly positioned to inject Rick with something the moment the family leaves the house. Morty points it out. Rick denies it is relevant. Beth walks in, takes one look at the syringe, takes it with her, and leaves. The syringe contained the antidote, the formula that would turn Rick back into a human. Rick built himself a pickle specifically so he would have an excuse not to go to therapy. And he built a mechanism to automatically reverse the transformation the moment the family was gone, so he could be back to normal before they returned. He planned this. He engineered it. He spent time and thought and scientific effort on constructing an exit from a 1-hour appointment. That is not a person who forgot about therapy. That is not a person who is too busy. That is a person who is so committed to avoiding the thing therapy would require: honesty, vulnerability, the experience of being seen clearly by another person, that he treated escaping it as a scientific problem worth solving. Rick applies his intelligence to the things that matter to him. He applied it here. What that tells you about how much therapy scared him is not subtle. Beth taking the syringe changes the plan immediately. Now, Rick is a pickle with no arms, no legs, and no way to reverse what he did. He gets knocked off the workbench by a cat, washed outside by rain, and ends up in a sewer. What follows is Rick doing what Rick does when cornered. He improvises. He builds. He survives. He bites the heads off cockroaches and uses their bodies as a crude way to move. He builds himself a set of limbs from rat bones and wire. He fights his way through the sewer and into a government building and takes out an entire facility of trained security personnel with improvised weapons while in the body of a pickle. It is absolutely ridiculous and completely entertaining, and the show knows exactly what it is doing by making it that way. Because every second of that action sequence is Rick choosing mortal danger over emotional honesty. He would rather be flushed into a sewer. He would rather fight rats. He would rather build himself a functioning body out of dead animal parts and battle his way through a building than sit in a chair and answer questions about how he feels. The action movie is not the episode. The action movie is what Rick does instead of the episode. It is one long, elaborate, physically brutal act of avoidance. And while all of this is happening, while Rick is fighting for his life in a building full of people trying to kill him, his family family is in a therapy office with a therapist named Dr. Wong. Dr. Wong does not wait for Rick. She works with whoever is in the room, and what she finds in that room is a family that has organized itself entirely around one person's inability to deal with his own pain. She watches Beth defend Rick's decision to turn himself into a pickle. She watches Summer and Morty try to talk about how Rick's behavior affects them and get interrupted and redirected. She watches the family perform normalcy while sitting in a therapy office because their grandfather turned himself into a vegetable to avoid being there. By the time Rick arrives, still in pickle form, covered in the evidence of everything he just survived, Dr. Wong has a clear picture. Rick sits down in front of her. He is a pickle in a rat bone exoskeleton, having just killed his way through a government facility. He is, by any measure, one of the most extreme beings ever to sit in a therapist's office. And Dr. Wong is not impressed. She is not scared. She is not distracted by the spectacle. She just looks at him and starts talking. She tells him that the reason he did not want to come to therapy is not that he is too busy or too smart or too important. It is because he is intelligent enough to know that she is right about him. That is the specific thing she says. He avoided this room because some part of him knew that what happens in this room is real, and real is the one thing Rick cannot afford to be for very long. She tells him that he uses his intelligence to make everything around him more interesting than the work of actually looking at himself. The adventures, the science, the constant forward motion, all of it serves the same function the flask serves. It keeps him pointed outward. As long as there is something to invent, or something to fight, or something to escape from, he does not have to turn the attention inward. The pickle was just a more obvious version of what Rick does every single day. Rick sits there, he does not argue, he does not have a comeback, he does not deflect or redirect or make a joke that changes the subject. He sits there in his pickle body and takes it, which is, for Rick Sanchez, an extraordinary thing. The man who always has an answer has nothing to say to Dr. Wong. Not because she is wrong, because she is completely right and he knows it. Then he gets back in the car with Beth and Morty and Summer, turns himself back into a human using the syringe, and immediately starts mocking therapy and making plans to go out drinking with Beth. The moment of honesty closes. The performance resumes. The flask is metaphorically back in his hand before the car reaches the driveway. But something happened in that room. Something small and real and important. Rick heard the truth about himself stated plainly by someone with no reason to protect him, and he did not run from it. He could not run from it. He was a pickle in an office. He had literally nowhere to go. But he also did not fight it. He sat with it. For about 45 seconds, Rick Sanchez let something true land without immediately destroying it. 45 seconds is not recovery. It is not a turning point. It is not the beginning of Rick getting better, but it is a crack, a small one. The first real indication that underneath all the engineering and the avoidance and the constant motion, there is a part of Rick that knows the truth about himself and has not fully made peace with burying it. Dr. Wong also says something else in that session that matters for understanding the full shape of Rick's problem. She traces the chain. She explains that Rick's way of treating emotion as weakness, as something to dismiss, as something too small for a person of his intelligence to bother with, has passed through to Beth, and Beth's version of that has passed through to her children. The avoidance is not just Rick's. It is a pattern the whole family learned from him, adapted in their own ways, and now carries forward without necessarily knowing where it came from. Rick did not just damage himself with this approach to his own pain. He taught it, not on purpose, not through a lesson, but through example, through being the most powerful presence in the room for decades and demonstrating consistently that the way you handle the things that hurt is to not handle them at all. You build something, you fight something, you drink something, you turn yourself into a pickle. You do anything except sit still long enough to feel it, and then you get back in the car and you make a plan to go out drinking. The most famous episode in the show's history is not about a pickle. It is about what the pickle is for. And what the pickle is for is the same thing the flask is for, the same thing the planet was for, the same thing the alien crystals were for. All of it. Every escalation, every scheme, every elaborate avoidance points at the same place, the garage in season 2. The thing waiting there that Rick could not drink his way past and could not bender his way around and could not pickle his way out of. That thing has a name, and the show finally gives it one, but not until season 5, and not before showing you something even more revealing about Rick's relationship with his own worst qualities. __quote _6 __. Because in season 3, the show asks a question nobody expected it to ask. What would Rick look like without any of the darkness, without the drinking, without the avoidance, without the pain that drives all of it? What is left if you remove everything toxic from Rick Sanchez? The answer is more disturbing than the question. Section 7, Toxic Rick. What's left when you remove the grief? Season 3, Episode 6, rest and relaxation. The episode starts with Rick and Morty returning from an adventure. Not at the beginning of the adventure, not in the middle, at the very end, after 6 days of something the show does not fully show you. Because what matters is not what happened, what matters is what it did to them. Morty is a mess. He is shaking, barely holding it together, making sounds that are not quite words. Rick looks like he has not slept in the entire 6 days. They land the ship, they sit there. The adventure is over, and both of them are clearly not okay. Rick's solution is an alien spa. Specifically, a spa with a machine that removes toxic elements from a person's mind and body. You step in, the machine scans you, pulls out everything it identifies as harmful to your mental state, and deposits it somewhere else. You step out clean, refreshed, free of whatever was dragging you down. Rick and Morty both use it. They step out feeling great, light, easy, unbothered. Whatever was heavy before is gone. They leave the spa without looking back. What they do not know yet is that the removed toxins did not disappear. They were deposited into a separate container inside the machine, and they are alive. The toxic parts of Rick and Morty are walking around, talking, thinking, planning, furious about what was done to them. Toxic Rick immediately starts working on a way out. Toxic Morty is a shaking, self-hating wreck who cannot hold himself together, but follows wherever Toxic Rick leads. This is the setup, and it is a clever setup. But the episode is not really about whether the toxic versions escape or get reabsorbed. It is about what the clean versions reveal. Because once you remove everything the machine identifies as harmful from Rick Sanchez, what is left is a completely different person. And that different person is deeply unsettling in ways the show takes its time making clear. Clean Rick is polite. He says "excuse me" after he burps instead of announcing it proudly. He is patient. He is thoughtful. He considers other people's feelings before speaking. He does not drink. His skin, the show makes a point of noting, is a normal human color instead of the gray-blue tint that Rick normally has. The color that comes from decades of alcohol running through his system. Without the alcohol, without the drugs, without the darkness, Rick looks like a regular person. He looks healthy, and he is completely unbearable to be around. Not because he is mean, because he is empty. The clean Rick that walks out of that spa has had something specific removed, along with the alcoholism and the anger and the nihilism and the cruelty. He has had his emotional attachments removed. His love for Morty is classified by the machine as a toxic element, irrational, destabilizing, a weakness that compromises function, and it gets pulled out with everything else. Clean Rick does not care about Morty. Not in a hostile way. He simply does not feel the pull. The thing that has, across 3 seasons, been the most consistent and most real part of Rick's character. The love for his grandson that he goes to extraordinary lengths to hide but cannot fully eliminate is classified as damage. It goes into the container with the alcoholism. It goes in with the pain. This is the episode's central argument, stated through the mechanics of a science fiction machine rather than through dialogue. Rick's love and Rick's damage are not separate things stored in separate places. They are tangled together so completely that a machine designed to remove one takes the other with it. The grief and the drinking and the nihilism and the addiction and the love, they all grew in the same place, from the same root, and you cannot pull the darkness out without pulling the warmth out too. Think about what this means for everything the previous sections have established. The flask is covering something. The planet-sized bender was trying to stay away from something. The pickle was engineering an escape from something. All of that, all the substance use, all the avoidance, all the elaborate schemes and escalating consumption, it is all connected to the same wound. And that wound is also where the love lives. Rick drinks because he is in pain. Rick is in pain because he lost something. People he loved, a life he had, a version of himself that existed before everything went wrong. The addiction and the grief and the love are 3 parts of the same thing. Remove any one of them and you do not get a healthier Rick. You get less Rick. The machine confirmed it. The machine, which has no feelings and no agenda, scanned Rick Sanchez and concluded that his love for Morty belongs in the same pile as his alcoholism. Toxic Rick, the version made entirely of what was removed, is a monster. He is cruel, reckless, dishonest, and completely consumed by the need to get back to the real world and cause damage. He escapes from the machine. He builds a device capable of making the entire planet toxic. He does not care about consequences. He is Rick with all the darkness and none of the warmth, which turns out to be Rick as a pure, destructive force with nothing underneath. But here is the part that matters. Toxic Rick is also the only version of Rick in this episode who genuinely cares about Morty. Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty are a unit. Toxic Rick, for all his monstrousness, will not leave Toxic Morty behind. He protects him. He is furious on his behalf. The irrational emotional attachment that Clean Rick had removed, the thing the machine classified as damage, is the only thing making Toxic Rick recognize unrecognizably human. Clean Rick figures this out. He is smart enough to see it even without the emotional capacity to feel it. He looks at Toxic Rick and realizes that the attachment to Morty is the lever. Toxic Rick can be stopped because he loves Toxic Morty. And Clean Rick, who no longer loves anyone, uses that love as a weapon to defeat the toxic version of himself. The episode does not comment on how awful that is. It does not stop to point out that Clean Rick just weaponized the most genuine thing about Toxic Rick and used it to win. It just happens, and the show moves on, because Rick and Morty trusts you to sit with the discomfort on your own. Eventually, the toxic versions are reabsorbed. Rick goes back to being the gray-blue, drinking, emotional attachment hiding Rick the show has always had. Morty goes back to being anxious and uncertain and desperate for approval. Everything returns to what it was. The spa machine ends up being the most honest mirror the show has ever held up to its main character. And then it gets put away and nobody talks about it again. But the information does not go away. The episode told you something permanent about the shape of Rick's problem. His drinking is not separate from his love. His addiction is not separate from his grief. His nihilism is not a philosophy he chose from a menu of options. It grew out of something real and specific and terrible that happened to him, and it shares its roots with every good thing still operating inside him. This is why simply removing the addiction does not produce a better Rick. This is why the flask cannot just be taken away and replaced with nothing. The flask is doing a job, a terrible job, with terrible side effects, causing damage to Rick and everyone around him. But it is doing a job that something real and painful assigned to it. Take it away without addressing the thing underneath, and you do not get a healthy Rick. You get a Rick who has been emptied out. A Rick who is pleasant and useful and completely hollow. The clean Rick in this episode has normal colored skin. The show draws your attention to this specifically. Decades of alcohol have given Rick his gray-blue tint. It is literally written into his appearance at the cellular level. Without the alcohol, he looks different. He looks like what he might have been before all of this started. And what he might have been, it turns out, is someone who is much easier to be around and much less interesting and much less real. Rick's reality, the actual weight of him, the thing that makes him Rick rather than just a very smart person, lives in the damage. Not because damage is good, not because the addiction is romantic or the drinking is cool or the pain is something to celebrate, but because it is true. It is where he actually lives, and the show refuses to pretend that removing it would produce something better. This is Rick and Morty being more honest about addiction than most shows manage. The standard story goes, person has addiction, person hits bottom, person gets clean, person becomes better version of themselves. That story is real, and it is true for many people, but it is not the only story. Sometimes the addiction is so deep and so old and so tangled up with everything the person is that there is no clean line between the damage and the self. Sometimes the thing you would have to remove is not just the drinking. It is the grief underneath the drinking, and the love underneath the grief, and the person underneath the love. Rick has not found a way through that. He has not even really tried, except for 45 seconds in Dr. Wong's office. He goes back to the flask. He goes back to the gray-blue skin and the constant drink and the nihilism that functions as a roof over everything he cannot deal with. But the episode has done its work. You know now what the drinking is protecting. You know what is in there, underneath all of it, both the worst of Rick and the best of Rick, inseparable and sharing the same address. What you do not know yet is how it started. You know Rick is in pain. You know he uses substances to manage it. You know the pain and the love are the same thing wearing different faces, but you do not know what created all of it in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 5 is going to tell you, and when it does, everything, every flask, every crystal, every planet, every garage, every pickle is going to make a different kind of sense. Because it turns out the drinking did not start as a habit. It started on a specific day in response to a specific thing, when Rick was a completely different person than the one you have been watching. Section 8, The Origin, Where the Drinking Started. Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack. For 4.5 seasons, the show let Rick be a mystery. You knew he drank, you knew he used drugs, you knew he was in pain, you knew the pain was real and serious and old, but you did not know where it came from. The show gave you pieces, a line here, a half-revealed memory there, a flashback that Rick himself admitted was not entirely true. It kept the origin just out of reach, close enough to feel like it existed, far enough that you could not quite see it. Rick Mirai Jack is where the distance closes. It is the episode where Morty finally sees Rick's full backstory. Not a fake version, not a version Rick constructed to deceive someone, but the real one. And what Morty sees, what the audience sees, is not the origin of a villain or the backstory of a comic book character. It is the origin of an addiction. Specific, simple, and completely completely devastating. Before any of this happened, before the flask, before the adventures, before the gray-blue skin and the catchphrase and the portal gun and the multiverse, Rick was a different person. He was a man with a wife and a daughter and a garage where he worked on science problems that interested him. His wife's name was Diane. His daughter was Beth, young, the same Beth who grows up to marry Jerry and have Morty and Summer in the show you have been watching. Rick, at this point in his life, was smart. He was always smart, but he was not yet the god-level, universe-hopping, indestructible force of nature the show presents. He was a person. A regular, grounded, present person with a family he was actually there for. One day, while Rick was working in his garage, another Rick showed up. A version of himself from a different dimension. One who had already figured out how to travel between realities. This other Rick offered to share the technology. He invited the Rick we know, Rick C-137, our Rick, to leave his life and come explore the infinite universe. Rick said no. He turned down the portal technology. He chose his family. The other Rick left. And then the other Rick sent a bomb. It killed Diane. It killed the young version of Beth. It took Rick's entire family, in a single moment, in his own garage, in the place he had chosen over everything the multiverse had to offer. He said no to infinity, and infinity destroyed what he had chosen instead. What happened to Rick after that is shown in the episode in a wordless sequence. No dialogue, just images. And the first images after the death of his family are Rick, in a house that is now empty, drinking. Not the casual, constant drinking of the man you have been watching for 4 seasons. This is different. This is the beginning. This is a person who has just had everything taken away, finding the thing that makes the next hour survivable. And then the hour after that, and then the day, and then the week, and then the months and years it takes him to build the portal technology on his own. Because he is Rick. Because his brain keeps working even when the rest of him is stopped. And because building the portal gun gives him something to point the grief at. He spends a long time consumed by grief and drinking before he perfects the portal gun. The show does not give you an exact number. It does not need to. The image is enough. Rick, alone, in a house that should have people in it, with alcohol and a project and nothing else. Crippled by loneliness, in a constant state of depression and intoxication, building the machine that will eventually let him go looking for the thing that destroyed his life. This is where the drinking started. Not as a habit, not as something Rick slipped into gradually over years of reckless living. It started on the worst day of his life, as an immediate response to an unbearable loss, and it never stopped because the loss never went away. Think about the math of this for a moment. Rick eventually shows up in the show's present as a man who appears to be around 70 years old. The death of Diane and Beth happened when Rick was a young adult. The episode shows him as a man in his 30s or so, young enough that Beth is still a small child. Between that moment and the pilot episode of the show, decades pass. Decades of drinking that started as grief management and calcified into the baseline operating condition described in Section 1. The flask that is always in his hand in Season 1 has been there, in one form or another, since the day the bomb went off. This is not a small thing to sit with. Most people who watched the early seasons of Rick and Morty saw a funny, chaotic, brilliant, drunk scientist, and absorbed the drinking as part of the character's personality. A trait, a quirk. Rick drinks, the same way Rick burps mid-sentence, and Rick says things nobody else would say. It felt like flavor. It felt designed. It was designed, but not as flavor. It was designed as the truth of a person who started drinking after the worst moment of his life and never found a reason to stop. Every flask in every episode is the direct continuation of what started in that empty house, in those months after Diane and Beth died, when Rick had nothing to do with the pain except drink through it and build and wait. The portal gun gets finished. Rick leaves the house. He begins traveling between realities. And the first thing he does with this extraordinary ability is not explore. It is not discover. It is not enjoy the infinite universe that the other Rick promised him. It is hunt. Rick's entire purpose, from the moment the portal gun is operational, is to find the specific Rick who killed his family and end him. This matters for understanding the addiction because it tells you something about what the drinking is for during this period. It is not just grief management anymore. It is fuel. Rick is running on alcohol and rage across dimensions, following a target he cannot find, killing alternate versions of himself when they get in his way, accumulating a body count and a criminal record and a reputation across the multiverse. All of it powered by the same substance he reached for on the worst day of his life. During this time, Rick is not close to anyone. He meets Bird Person at a music festival, where Rick is dealing drugs, and they form a friendship and eventually fight in a war together. Bird Person is the first real connection Rick has made since Diane and Beth died. And even that connection exists inside the context of Rick's mission. He is still moving. He is still hunting. The friendship is real, but it exists in the margins of an obsession. When the war ends and Bird Person chooses to stay behind rather than travel with Rick, Rick loses the one person who had come close to seeing him clearly. He goes back to moving alone, drinking alone, alone, hunting alone. The loneliness compounds. The drinking that started as grief shifted to fuel, now becomes the companion, the constant, the one thing that is always there when everything and everyone else is not. Rick eventually stops actively hunting for Rick Prime. Not because he finds him, but because the hunt goes nowhere, and the years keep passing, and at some point, despair is heavier than rage. He crashes into a dimension where a version of Beth is alive and grown, where there are grandchildren he has never met, where there is something that looks like a family. He does not announce himself as a broken person who needs somewhere to land. He arrives as Rick Sanchez, genius, flask in hand, ready to take his grandson on adventures. But now you know what the flask is. Now you know how old it is. Now you know that the man who showed up in that garage at the start of the show has been drinking since he was a young adult, since the day a bomb took everything, since the moment the choice he made, the choice of family over infinite possibility, was punished in the most total way imaginable. The bird person scene in season 1 told you Rick uses drugs and alcohol to numb himself. Rick Murray Jack tells you what he is numbing. It is not vague existential sadness about the nature of the universe. It is specific. It is the specific pain of a man who chose love over everything else and watched love get used against him. A man who said no to the multiverse because he had a family. And then the multiverse took the family anyway. Everything after that, the drinking, the drugs, the planet-sized benders, the pickle, the toxic self, the catchphrase, the garage at the end of autoerotic assimilation, all of it traces back here to a garage and a bomb and a young Rick who did the right thing and lost everything for it. The drinking is not a character trait, it is a scar. It is the shape of a wound that never closed because Rick never let it close. Because closing it would require admitting it is there, and admitting it is there means feeling it, and feeling it means going back to the garage and the bomb and the specific moment when the life he chose ended. So he drinks. He has been drinking since then. He will keep drinking because the thing underneath has not changed in all the decades since it was created, and no substance in any dimension has been able to make it smaller. But here is the thing about carrying something that heavy for that long. It does not stay inside the person who is carrying it. It spills, it moves, it gets into everything around it, and the people closest to Rick have been swimming in the overflow of his grief for their entire lives without knowing where it came from. __quote _8___. What that spillage looks like, what it costs the people who love Rick just by being near him, is a story that starts with his daughter and ends with his grandson, and runs through every member of the family in between. Section 9. The family it broke. Beth, Morty, and the inherited damage. There is a version of this story that stays inside Rick's garage. Rick drinks. Rick uses drugs. Rick crosses lines to get access to substances. Rick lives with the consequences in his own body, in his own mind, in his own quiet moments of despair. His problem, his damage, his garage. The rest of the family gets to be separate from it. Affected sometimes, inconvenienced occasionally, but fundamentally okay, untouched at the core. That version is not the one the show tells, because the show understands something about addiction that most stories about it get wrong. Addiction does not stay in one person. It does not respect the boundaries between one life and the lives immediately next to it. It moves. It teaches. It shapes the people nearby in ways those people cannot always see or name, because the shaping happened before they were old enough to recognize it for what it was. Rick's drinking and drug use did not begin when he moved into the garage. It began decades before the show starts, in the aftermath of losing Diane and Beth, in an empty house where the only company was alcohol and a project and grief with nowhere to go. By the time Rick shows up in the pilot, the addiction is not new. It is old. It is architectural. It has already had years and years to do its work on the people closest to him, starting with his daughter. Beth Smith grew up with a father who was not there. Not absent the way a busy parent is absent, physically present but distracted, available on weekends, trying in the ways available to him. Rick was gone, fully, completely, for large portions of Beth's life. He left, he traveled. He pursued his obsession across dimensions while Beth grew up without him, with a mother whose name the show barely mentions, in a house shaped by the space her father left behind. This is one of the clearest and most documented effects of growing up with a parent whose addiction controls their behavior. The child does not just miss the parent. The child organizes themselves around the missing. They spend years waiting for the parent to come back, to be present, to be the person the child needs them to be. And that waiting does not produce neutral feelings. It produces a very specific kind of damage. The kind where the child concludes, somewhere underneath all conscious thought, that the reason the parent is not present is something about the child. That they were not enough to make the parent stay. That if they had been better, smarter, more impressive, more worth staying for, the parent would have stayed. Beth became a horse surgeon. She is brilliant at it. And the show makes clear, across multiple episodes and conversations, that Beth's need to be impressive impressive. Her drive, her achievement, her refusal to accept being ordinary is directly connected to her father. She needs Rick to see her as worth something. She needs to be the kind of person Rick would choose. Because the deepest wound in Beth Smith is the one that says Rick left. And if Rick left, it must have been because she was not enough to make him stay. This is why Beth cannot hold Rick accountable in the way a parent probably should. She watches Rick lie to her children, manipulate her household, vanish when it is convenient, drink constantly in front of everyone, and she does not stop him. She does not draw the line. She has spent so long needing Rick's approval that enforcing a boundary with him feels like risking his approval, which feels like risking the only thing that could heal the original wound. So she lets it go. Again and again, she lets it go. Dr. Wong identifies this in the Pickle Rick episode with calm, clinical precision. She tells the family that Rick responds to vulnerability and emotion by dismissing it or belittling it. And Beth, having grown up with that response as the only one available, learned not to be vulnerable, learned not to show emotion, learned to protect herself by becoming someone who would not give Rick the opportunity to make her feel small for having feelings. She built herself in the image of what Rick seemed to respect because that was the only way to stay safe around him. And then she passed that on to her own children. Not on purpose, not through a decision, through the automatic, invisible transmission of learned behavior from one generation to the next. Morty and Summer grew up in a house where Beth, shaped by Rick, treated emotional openness as weakness, where the way you handled difficulty was to not handle it, to push through, to be capable and functional and not make your pain into everyone else's problem. Dr. Wong traces this chain explicitly, Rick to Beth to the kids. One person's addiction and the coping style that grew around it, becoming the emotional template for an entire family. Now look at Morty specifically. Morty Smith is 14 years old at the start of the show. He has a learning disability. He has no real friends. He struggles in school. He is anxious, uncertain, desperate for approval, and has built his entire sense of self-worth around being useful to Rick, the one person in his life who seems to see something in him, even if the way Rick expresses that is mostly through using Morty as a tool for dangerous adventures. The learning disability matters here. The show presents it as a fact about Morty without explaining its origin, but the family tree it exists in is worth examining. Beth drinks. Beth has always drunk. Wine is her version of Rick's flask, present at most hours, normalized, never quite described as a problem by anyone in the household, even though the evidence is clear. There is an episode where Beth is drunk in bed in the middle of the morning and accidentally gives Summer a black eye with an empty wine bottle while trying to hand it to her. This is presented almost as a throwaway moment. The show does not stop on it, but it is there. The connection between a parent's drinking during pregnancy and a child's learning difficulties is well established and real. The show does not state this connection directly. It does not have to. It puts all the pieces in the same room and trusts the audience to see them. Beth drinks the way a person drinks who learned to drink from a parent who drank to manage grief. Morty has a learning disability in a family where heavy drinking spans at least 2 generations. The line is not drawn for you, but it is there. This is what Rick's addiction looks like 3 generations in. Not just the man with the flask, the daughter with the wine bottle, the grandson who cannot keep up in school. The family system that has organized itself around one person's unprocessed grief in ways that nobody in the family fully understands because they have never been given the full picture. Summer shows different symptoms. She is outwardly more functional than Morty, more confident, more socially capable, better at performing normalcy. But Summer has her own version of the family damage. She idealizes Rick in ways the show explicitly flags as unhealthy. She wants to be like him. She gravitates toward his chaos and his confidence and his apparent ability to not care what anyone thinks. What she is doing, without knowing she is doing it, is trying to solve the same problem Beth tried to solve, trying to become the kind of person Rick would choose, trying to be impressive enough that the most powerful presence in her life would see her and stay. Rick, to his credit in a very limited way, is sometimes aware of this. There are moments across the series where Rick seems to recognize what he has done to the people around him. The season 5 episode where he acknowledges that his relationship with Morty is unhealthy. The moments where he looks at Beth and something complicated crosses his face that is not quite guilt but is adjacent to it. He is not completely blind to the damage. He just does not know what to do with the knowledge, the same way he does not know what to do with any of the things he knows about himself that he cannot fix. The family therapy in Pickle Rick was recommended by the school, not because the school knew Rick's backstory, because the kids were showing up with symptoms. Morty acting out, Summer acting out, behavior that pointed back to something in the home that was not working. The school saw the children and recommended the family get help. The family went, minus Rick, who turned himself into a pickle rather than participate. And Dr. Wong, in one session, traced the whole chain back to its source and named it clearly. Rick's avoidance of emotion emotion, passed to Beth, expressed through Beth's parenting, visible in Morty and Summer's behavior at school. One man's response to grief, echoing across 3 generations of people who never asked to carry it. This is what the show means when it builds the Smith family the way it does. None of them are just characters with their own independent problems that happen to overlap. They are the downstream effects of a very specific upstream event: a bomb in a garage, a man who found alcohol and could not put it down, a daughter who grew up without her father and built herself around the hole he left, grandchildren who grew up in that daughter's house, absorbing the template she learned without knowing she learned it. Rick's addiction did not stay in Rick. It could not. It never does. The tragedy of this family is not that they are broken. It is that they are broken in the shape of Rick's original wound. And none of them, not even Rick, have ever fully seen the shape clearly enough to understand what they are carrying or where it came from. Section 8 showed you where the drinking started. Section 9 shows you how far it traveled. But there is one more stop on this journey, because in Season 7, Rick finally gets what he has wanted since the day the bomb went off. He finds the specific Rick who killed his family. He gets the revenge he built his entire post-Diane life around. He gets the thing that was supposed to make it stop. And then he picks up the flask again. Section 10, Revenge and Relapse. What killing Rick Prime actually cost. Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican. This is the episode where Rick gets what he has been chasing since before the show began. Since before the portal gun. Since before the Citadel and the multiverse and the gray-blue skin and the flask that never empties. Since the day the bomb went off in his garage and took Diane and took Beth and took the life Rick had chosen over everything the universe was offering him. He finds Rick Prime. He kills him. And then the drinking gets worse. That is the ending of this story that nobody who only watches the surface of the show was prepared for. The revenge arc that ran underneath the entire series, quietly in early seasons, more openly in later ones, resolves in Season 7. And it resolves completely. Rick does not almost get Rick Prime. He does not watch him escape again. He does not arrive too late. He gets there. He wins. Rick Prime is gone. The specific being responsible for destroying Rick's life is dead at Rick's hands, and it does nothing. It fixes nothing. The grief is still there. The drinking is still there. The damage to the family is still there. The gray-blue skin is still there. The flask is back in his hand before the episode is over. And in the episodes that follow, the show confirms what the more honest part of the audience probably already knew. That the relapse that follows the killing of Rick Prime is real. And that the substance use that sparks back up in the aftermath is not a coincidence. It is the proof that the revenge was never going to be the cure, because the revenge was never the actual problem. Let's go back to how Rick Prime finally gets found. It takes Evil Morty, a version of Morty from another dimension who spent years planning his own escape from Rick's influence, to actually locate Rick Prime. Rick and Morty and Evil Morty end up in the same place, facing the same target. And what happens next is not a triumphant action sequence with a clear hero and a clear victory. It is messy and costly. And by the time it is over, the hollowness of it is already visible. Rick Prime does not go out the way a proper villain is supposed to go out. He does not give a speech. He does not admit what he did or explain why, or offer Rick any of the things Rick has spent decades imagining he would get from this moment. He is just gone, dead. The specific being who dropped the bomb on Rick's garage, who killed Diane, who killed young Beth, who set the entire tragedy in motion, removed from existence. Rick got what he came for, and Rick stands there with nothing. This is the part of addiction and grief that most stories skip over because it is uncomfortable and it does not make a satisfying ending. The idea that underneath an addiction is always a fixable wound, a specific trauma, a specific loss, a specific event that, if addressed or resolved, would release the person from the grip of the substance. Find the thing, resolve the thing, get better. That is the story we are used to. Rick and Morty tells a different story. It tells the story where Rick finds the thing, resolves the thing, and gets worse. Not dramatically worse. Not in a way that produces a new crisis or a new rock bottom that the show can build an episode around. Just quietly, persistently worse. The flask goes back up. The substance use that had been building towards something, all that grief-fueled momentum that pointed at Rick Prime as the destination, has nowhere to point now, so it turns inward. And inward is the one direction Rick has never been able to go. Think about what Rick spent decades believing. On some level, underneath all the nihilism and the philosophy and the practice performance of not caring about anything, Rick had a structure, a reason. The drinking started as a response to losing Diane and Beth, but it continued for all those years, fueled partly by purpose. He was going to find Rick Prime. He was building towards something. The grief had a direction. The rage had a target. The substance use was, in its own terrible way, part of a functioning system. Pain management plus motivation plus forward momentum, all tangled together together, all pointing at the same endpoint: kill Rick Prime. And then what? Rick never answered that question because he never let himself get close enough to it. The question of what comes after was always safely hypothetical. Rick Prime was not findable, not for most of the series. The hunt was ongoing. The endpoint was theoretical. And a theoretical endpoint can sustain a person for a very long time, because as long as you have not reached it, you can keep telling yourself that reaching it will change things. Rick reached it. Things did not change. The confirmation of this comes in the episodes that follow on Morderkin. The show has Rick's substance abuse sparking back up in the aftermath of the killing. The drinking that, in season 6, had shown some signs of being part of Rick's acknowledged effort to be better. He states at the start of season 6 that he recognizes his unhealthy behavior and has to work at improving, reasserts itself after Rick Prime is gone. The thing that was supposed to free him removes the last external structure holding the grief in a particular shape, and the grief, freed, spreads. This is not a surprising outcome to anyone who understands how this kind of pain works, but it is worth saying clearly because the show does not make a speech about it. It just shows you Rick, after the kill, reaching for what he always reaches for, and the reaching tells you everything. Evil Morty says something during the events of Unmortrican that is worth sitting with. He tells Rick and Morty that Rick Prime built his whole sense of self around not caring, around being the version of Rick who chose the multiverse over family, who never got attached, who never let anything matter. And he tells them that Rick C-137, their Rick, our Rick, has spent decades doing the opposite of not caring, while performing not caring as loudly as possible. That the revenge mission was not really about justice. It was about the fact that Rick could not find any other container for how much he cared. The grief, the love, the loss, all of it had to go somewhere, and it went into the hunt, because the hunt was the only thing that felt proportional to the size of what he was carrying. Now the hunt is over. The container is gone. What is proportional to the size of what Rick carries, with Rick Prime dead and the mission complete and nothing left to aim the pain at? Nothing, it turns out. Nothing is proportional. Nothing fits. So the flask comes back up and the substances come back, and Rick goes on the way he always has. Forward, moving, never quite still, because stillness is the one condition under which the full weight of everything he has lost might actually settle on him. There is something almost mathematical about the relapse that follows Unmortrican. Rick's addiction has always had a fuel source, the grief underneath it, the specific and enormous loss that started it, the decades of accumulated pain that kept it going. What the revenge mission provided was a shape for that fuel. It gave the pain somewhere to go. The drinking was grief, but it was also preparation, also endurance, also the way Rick kept himself functional enough to keep looking. The substance use and the mission were always connected. When the mission ends, the substance use does not end with it. It recalibrates. It becomes purely about the grief again, without the mission to give it direction. This is the final truth the show tells about Rick's addiction, and it is the most honest one. All the way back in Section 1, the flask was described as something Rick uses to maintain a baseline, to keep the internal noise at a manageable level so he can function. Section 8 told you where the noise came from: a bomb, a garage, the worst day of Rick's life. Section 10 tells you what happens when you remove every external reason for the noise, and it still does not stop. It does not stop. It was never going to stop, because the noise is not about Rick Prime. Rick Prime was the cause of the loss, but he was not the loss itself. Killing Rick Prime does not bring Diane back. It does not undo the decades of Beth growing up without her father. It does not fix Morty's learning difficulties, or Summer's hero worship, or Beth's wine dependency, or the family system that organized itself around one man's unprocessed grief. It does not give Rick back the life he chose before the bomb fell. It does not make the garage from season 2 unhappen. It does not translate the catchphrase. It does not reverse the gray-blue skin. It just means Rick Prime is dead. That is all it means, and that is not enough. It was never going to be enough, because what Rick lost on the day of the bomb is not something that can be restored by destroying the person who took it. You cannot drink your way back there either. You cannot bender your way back there, or pickle your way back there, or detox your way back there, or hunt your way back there. The thing Rick lost is gone. It has been gone since before the show started, and every substance, every scheme, every adventure, every bottle and crystal and alien drug and planet-sized bender was Rick trying to solve a problem that does not have a solution, trying to fill a space that cannot be filled, trying to get back to a garage that no longer exists in any dimension he has access to. The flask goes back up after Unmortrican. The relapse confirms what the whole series has been building toward. Rick's addiction was never about the substances. The substances were always about the loss. And the loss does not care that Rick Prime is dead. The loss just keeps being the loss, the same same size it has always been, patient the way only permanent things can be patient. Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in the universe. He can solve problems that would defeat every other mind in existence. He has the whole multiverse available to him. He has defeated gods and governments and his own evil self and the entity that murdered his family. He cannot solve this one. Not with the portal gun, not with alien technology, not with intelligence or rage or revenge or an infinite supply of dimensions to hide in. The flask is still there. It was always going to still be there. And somewhere in a garage, in the dimension he chose to land in because it had a Beth and a family and something that looked enough like what he lost to be bearable, Rick Sanchez sits at his workbench and drinks and carries what he has always carried and keeps going the only way he knows how. Forward, moving, never quite still. Because the moment he stops, the garage is right there waiting for him. And this time, nobody passes out before the machine is ready. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.